Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Melissa's feet touched Nigerian soil with the weariness of a bird returning to a storm-tossed nest. The air in Brinley, thick with the scent of diesel and dried earth, welcomed her like a long-lost memory she wasn't sure she had missed. She rolled her suitcase past the scattered taxis and chewing gum vendors at the terminal, her chest carrying both the weight of 2 years away and the fragile hope that home had remained unchanged. She had left Ava behind with her childhood best friend, Geraldine, a woman she trusted the way roots trust the earth. Geraldine had promised to keep an eye on Ava, to love her like her own, to fill in the gaps Melissa couldn't reach while chasing better-paying nursing contracts abroad. And Melissa, desperate to secure a future for the daughter she raised alone, believed her without blinking. But lately, something in Ava's voice during their weekly video calls had curdled, like milk left out in the heat. The laughter was thinner. The pauses were longer. And then, one day, Ava simply stopped answering. No fight, no excuses. Just silence. It haunted Melissa on every shift she pulled in Lisbon, whispering behind her scrubs, riding the bus back with her at dawn, curling up beside her like a shadow in every rented apartment she moved through. So she bought a ticket without telling a soul. The surprise was supposed to be a birthday gift, a mother's warm ambush. But nothing, not the dusty wind that tossed her hair, or the rusted gate that groaned as she pushed it open, prepared her for the sight that slapped her square in the soul. Ava, her only daughter, crouched barefoot on the tiled kitchen floor, scrubbing with a sponge as if her dignity had been washed down the drain. She didn't move at first. It was as though time itself had tripped and fallen on its face, lying breathless between mother and daughter. Ava looked up slowly, the light catching her face just enough for Melissa to see the hollows beneath her eyes and the hesitation in her expression, as if joy now needed permission to bloom. Geraldine's voice, sharp as a snapped bone, floated in from the living room like a careless insult. "Ava, did you find that charger yet?" The words struck Melissa like stones. She stepped fully into the house, her heels echoing against the tiled floor with the finality of a judge's gavel. Geraldine was sprawled across the velvet sofa, a glass of wine in hand, the television glowing in front of her like a campfire for cowards. When she finally turned her head and saw Melissa, she blinked, not in guilt but in irritation, as if the presence of the woman who trusted her was an inconvenience. "Well, look who blew in with the dust," she said with a smirk that tried and failed to rise to a smile. Melissa's lips didn't move. Her eyes flicked from the wine to Ava's wrinkled skirt, to the calluses on her daughter's hands, telltale signs of a life mishandled. Her heart roared in her chest, a lion rattling its cage, but she swallowed the fury like a bitter pill. There was too much she didn't know yet, too many questions clawing at her insides. Ava's body had gone rigid, like a puppet holding its last thread, waiting for someone to cut the tension. Melissa forced herself to smile, barely, and said, "I thought I'd surprise you for your birthday. Seems like I did." Dinner was a strained theater production, the kind where no one knew their lines, but everyone kept performing anyway. Geraldine insisted they eat together, claiming she had cooked jollof and fried plantains specially for Ava's birthday, even though Ava hadn't mentioned it was her birthday and the food smelled reheated. Melissa sat across from Geraldine, watching her with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. Geraldine talked a mile a minute, spinning half-truths into full-blown fairy tales, acting like she'd carried Ava on her back through fire and flood. Ava sat quietly, chewing each bite as if it cost her something. At one point, Melissa placed a hand gently on her daughter's knee under the table, a silent question. Ava flinched, and that flinch said more than 1,000 stories could. After dinner, Melissa asked to see Ava's room. Geraldine waved her off, saying, "It's just the storeroom for now, until we rearrange the house properly." But Melissa didn't wait for permission. She walked down the dim corridor, opened the last door, and her stomach dropped. A musty, windowless box, barely wide enough for a bed, a thin mattress, a folded wrapper, and a cracked plastic bucket in the corner. No fan, no wardrobe. Just a girl's silence written in dust. When Melissa turned to look at Ava, her voice came out in a whisper soaked in disbelief. "You've been sleeping here?" Ava nodded, her eyes heavy with unshed truths. Melissa sat on the edge of the bed, if one could call it that, and pulled Ava close. "Tell me everything," she said. Ava hesitated for a second before the dam broke. Words spilled out like a wound that had been stitched too tight, bursting under pressure. Ava spoke in hushed tones, each sentence like a stone tumbling down a long hill of silence. It started shortly after Melissa left. Geraldine had been kind at first, even affectionate, like a sister-turned-aunt, warm and familiar. But slowly, the tides turned. Chores became routines. Routines became expectations. Expectations became punishment. Her phone was taken under the guise of focus. Her allowance stopped. She wasn't allowed to visit friends. "She said you told her to discipline me, that you were tired of me slacking," Ava whispered, voice trembling. Melissa's jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She knew now Geraldine had not only betrayed her trust, she had poisoned her daughter's mind with lies, watering weeds in the garden she had sworn to tend. Melissa remembered the way Geraldine had held her hand at the airport, promising to be a second mother. But some women wore their hatred like perfume, sweet on the outside, choking once you inhaled. Ava paused, then added, "She said you weren't sending money anymore, that you forgot about me." That lie burned worst of all. Melissa had sent money monthly. She had skipped meals and worked double shifts to make sure Ava never lacked. Now, all that sacrifice lay in a stranger's account and her daughter's broken trust. Melissa exhaled slowly, her voice steady but low, like thunder rumbling on the horizon. "She played me, but she used you." And in that moment, under a cracked ceiling in a borrowed storeroom, Melissa made a silent vow to take back what was hers, to reclaim her daughter's light, and to rip off the mask her friend had worn for far too long. Melissa barely slept that night. The fan in the guest room wheezed weakly as if mimicking the state of her spirit, exhausted, shaky, but still turning. She lay awake on the stiff mattress, eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling, listening for every shuffle outside the door. Geraldine's laughter floated intermittently from the living room, muffled and sour like the distant sound of a party you were never invited to. But it was Ava's silence that echoed loudest. In all the years Melissa had raised her daughter, she had never seen Ava so hollow-eyed, so careful with her words, as though the truth itself was a fragile vase she was afraid to shatter. Somewhere deep in her chest, maternal rage boiled like a forgotten pot on fire, but Melissa knew better than to let it bubble over just yet. One outburst would only tip Geraldine off, and if Ava was to come out of this with dignity, it would require more than fury. So she waited till dawn, and when the first fingers of sunlight crept across the dusty floor, she slipped into Ava's room with soft steps and a steady resolve. The girl was already awake, sitting up with knees hugged to her chest, her eyes bloodshot from a night that had offered no comfort. Melissa sat beside her, wordless for a stretch, until Ava broke the silence with a whisper that sliced through the morning stillness like a blade. "I thought you forgot about me." Melissa's heart cracked like thin ice under heavy boots. She turned to face her daughter fully, her fingers gently brushing the corner of Ava's mouth, where a faint bruise had started to yellow. "Never," she said, and that one word held all the pain, guilt, and longing she had swallowed across 2 continents and countless sleepless nights. Ava nodded slowly, her lips twitching with emotion she didn't have the energy to express. It was then Melissa knew this wasn't just about chores or harsh words. It was emotional captivity, disguised in the garb of guardianship. Geraldine hadn't just overstepped. She had built herself a kingdom and crowned Ava its mute servant. Melissa asked simple questions in a tone soft as linen. When did she stop being kind? What does she do when I send money? Ava responded in fragments, each piece more disturbing than the last. The money had never reached her. Geraldine had claimed Melissa sent a one-time lump sum and then vanished. She often told Ava she was a burden, that her mother had moved on. And when Ava cried, Geraldine would tighten her grip on household duties, sometimes slapping her across the face, always reminding her whose roof she slept under. She said I should be grateful, Ava muttered, that people like me don't deserve luxury. Melissa blinked hard. That word, people like me, gnawed at her like termites in old wood. She reached for Ava's hand and held it tightly, anchoring her daughter to a reality outside the lies. You deserve everything good, she said, her voice trembling like a violin string pulled too tight. And we're going to make this right. Later that day, Melissa walked into Brindley Town alone, her steps measured, her gaze forward, but her thoughts spinning like clothes in a washing machine. The roads were familiar, yet the silence of old memories hummed through the air like forgotten lullabies. She passed the dusty playground where she and Geraldine once sold oranges as children, past the community clinic where they both dreamed of becoming doctors before life veered off script. Everything was the same, and yet it all felt counterfeit, like the town had been covered with a thin layer of deceit that only she could now see. At the corner near St. Amelia's Chapel, she found Nora, the childhood friend who once braided her hair and now worked as a nurse in the clinic. Nora's eyes widened at the sight of Melissa, then softened as recognition blossomed. After brief pleasantries, Melissa leaned in and asked quietly, "What do you know about Geraldine and Ava?" Nora hesitated, twisting her fingers in her lap, the weight of years clinging to her expression. "People talk," she began. "They say Geraldine's girl, your girl, works like a maid, that she doesn't attend events, that she's barely allowed out." Melissa's chest tightened. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" she asked. Nora sighed, looking down. "It's Geraldine. She knows how to smile when people are watching, and she always says she's doing you a favor." That sentence hit like a falling branch, sudden, messy, and uncalled for. "A favor? A favor? A favor? A favor? A favor? A favor? A favor? Atakava vakor benjavakar. A favor? A favor? Ditembia samoanenes a favor? Amananmon infectin tebentos tementiametavar. A favor? A favor? Iluri veserigar chica vursabo pacore severcore. A favor timententes wordica zavarar. Onnientintin bever timentethambever a favor word. Raman babord embetemenidwart correstores urusabord. Orban vapodambor tebentebibior. Vafola bon, por muchos egwentamatamparcor a trabar wushidin, urusais. Melissa swallowed hard, thanked Nora, and walked away with her head high but her soul on its knees. She now knew this betrayal had roots that ran deeper than she feared. By evening, Melissa returned to Geraldine's house, her face composed, her movements deliberate, her smile the kind that doesn't touch the eyes. Geraldine, ever the actress, poured 2 glasses of wine and patted the seat beside her. "Long day?" she asked with that sugary tone that now made Melissa's skin crawl. "Took a walk around town," Melissa said, swirling her glass. "Stopped by the old chapel. Remember when we used to steal mangoes from behind the altar?" Geraldine laughed, genuinely. Ah, those were the days. But beneath her chuckle was a flicker of unease. Melissa watched her closely. "Ava's changed," she said softly, testing the waters. Geraldine shrugged. "Teenage hormones. They all go through it." Melissa nodded slowly, as if agreeing, then let silence stretch between them like a rubber band on the verge of snapping. "You ever wonder why life brings people back just when things start to unravel?" she asked, letting the question hang. Geraldine stiffened slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" But Melissa didn't answer. She simply smiled, small, mysterious, the kind of smile a woman wears when she knows the tide is turning. That night, while Geraldine slept under her fake silk sheets and dreams spun of control, Melissa and Ava whispered in the back room under candlelight. Ava retrieved a note she had hidden behind a stack of old exercise books. It was from Geraldine's son, Liam. Just a few lines. She doesn't treat you right. I see it. I'm sorry. I want to help. Melissa's hand trembled as she read it. The cracks had begun. And when a house has cracks, it's only a matter of time before the walls come tumbling down. The next morning broke with a soft drizzle, the kind of rain that tiptoed across rooftops like secrets too timid to be heard. Melissa sat by the window in the guest room, watching droplets slide down the glass like tears she had no more strength to shed. Her mind was a whirlpool of memory and motive, pulling her deeper into the undertow of questions she had ignored for too long. She thought about how Geraldine used to be the girl who split her meat pies in half at lunch, who shared her school sandals during a storm, who once stayed up all night tending to Melissa's fever without being asked. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe Geraldine had always worn her affection like a mask, held in place by convenience and envy. Melissa now saw the cracks she once mistook for character. Every compliment that came with a backhand, every hug that lasted just one heartbeat too long, every favor that turned into a debt owed. They weren't red flags then, they were rose-colored memories painted by loyalty. But hindsight was cruel and clear-eyed. Ava, still curled under a thick blanket on the mattress, stirred faintly in her sleep. Her cheeks were wet, but not from the rain. Melissa knew she had to tread carefully now. Geraldine was no fool. She had built her narrative on precision, on a reputation polished to a shine. To expose her would require more than words. It would need a truth so undeniable, even Geraldine's honeyed tongue couldn't coat it in lies. And that truth, she believed, might start with Liam. Melissa waited until midday before calling Liam out to the back of the house under the guise of asking him to help clean the outdoor generator. The boy, lanky and awkward with limbs that hadn't quite grown into their strength, shuffled toward her with a hesitant gait. His eyes, so much like Geraldine's but devoid of their cruelty, met hers with a flicker of recognition. She handed him a rag and spoke low, as though the bricks themselves might snitch. "I found your note." He froze, like a deer caught between flight and fight, but Melissa continued before panic could hijack his limbs. "I'm not angry. I just need to understand." Liam swallowed, nodding slowly. Then, like someone cracking their own shell open, he began to speak. He told her about the nights Ava was denied food for not finishing chores, about how Geraldine locked her in the storeroom, once when she asked to attend youth fellowship, about how he overheard his mother lying on the phone to Melissa, laughing afterwards like deception was a parlor game. "She said you were too dumb to notice." "That you'd believe anything if she said it with a smile," Liam confessed, his voice quivering with shame. Melissa's jaw clenched so tightly her molars ached. But she forced herself calm, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You did the right thing by writing that note," she said. "And you're doing the braver thing now." Liam looked down, tears balancing on his lower lashes. "I just didn't know how to stop her." Melissa looked toward the house, her eyes narrowing like a hawk locking onto prey. "That's what we're about to figure out." That evening, Geraldine returned from her hair appointment smelling of fruit-scented relaxer and false confidence. Her nails were freshly painted, long and red like the claws of a predator dressed for praise. Melissa sat at the dining table pretending to scroll through her phone, watching from the corner of her eye as Geraldine floated past in her Ankara dress, humming a gospel tune. Ava stayed in the kitchen, too quiet to be invisible, too frightened to be bold. As Geraldine picked at a plate of suya like a queen sampling servant fare, Melissa asked casually, "Have you ever thought about how people talk in this town?" Geraldine arched a brow, popping a piece of meat into her mouth. "People always talk," she replied. "Why do you ask?" Melissa shrugged, her tone light, but her words laced with quiet venom. I passed by the clinic again today. Apparently, some people think Ava doesn't belong here, that she's more help than houseguest. Geraldine laughed, too quickly, too sharply. You know how people exaggerate, she said, waving her manicured fingers in the air. Besides, you know how teenagers are. She probably told someone that because I made her wash plates. You know how dramatic they get. Melissa nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed. Do you think Ava would say something like that if it weren't true? Geraldine's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Melissa, she said sweetly, you've been away for 2 years. You can't just return and start what? Melissa interrupted, her voice now like ice in a glass of fire. Asking why my daughter looks like she's been carrying a house on her back, or why you've been feeding me lies with a side of silence. Geraldine stood up sharply, but Melissa didn't flinch. For the first time, the power had shifted. The days that followed were filled with a strange stillness, the kind that slinks into a home when truths start crawling out from under the carpet. Geraldine became distant, moving through the house like someone afraid their secrets might grow legs and follow them. She avoided eye contact with Melissa, speaking only when necessary, her usual dominance replaced with a nervous politeness that grated against her nature. Ava, on the other hand, began to stretch slowly, cautiously, like a flower testing the morning air after a long drought. She started speaking more during meals, laughing faintly when Melissa joked about how terrible her egusi soup used to be. Liam hovered nearby most days, watching his mother with a kind of confusion that only children of manipulative parents know, where love and fear wear the same face. Melissa spent her mornings compiling everything she had, Liam's statements, Ava's recollections, her bank receipts showing months of transfers, even a voice memo she'd secretly recorded when Geraldine muttered one night on a call to someone, I've told her I'm doing her a favor. She can't come back now. That recording, rough as it was, became Melissa's secret weapon. But she wasn't ready to use it just yet. Timing, like the hand that turns a doorknob, was everything. So she waited and she watched. And as the sun set one evening, casting long shadows across the tiled floor, Melissa looked at her daughter, the same girl who once danced in puddles and read bedtime stories aloud with 3 different voices, and knew that no matter what storm was still to come, the wind had already begun to change direction. The mask was slipping, and soon it would fall. Melissa stood by the open window the next morning, watching as a neighbor's rooster strutted down the street like it owned the dawn. She felt the breeze crawl into the room, warm and sticky, carrying with it the scent of boiled yam and gossip. Brindley was a town that watched its people the way a hawk watched field mice, closely and without blinking. That morning, she made up her mind. No more hinting. No more veiled jabs at Geraldine's painted lies. She needed evidence so heavy it could knock down the castle Geraldine had built with other people's trust. And she knew just where to begin. Slipping into jeans and a faded blouse, she called Ava and Liam into the room. Their faces bore 2 different shades of hesitation, but their eyes carried the same question, what now? Melissa didn't waste time with long speeches. She handed Ava her phone and whispered, record anything. When she speaks to you alone. When she slips up. Save it all. We'll do this the smart way. Then to Liam she said, I need your help too. Quiet help. You're the only one who knows what she says when no one's watching. Liam nodded solemnly, like a soldier taking orders. The boy had grown in the past week, not in height, but in spine. Ava, still scarred by caution, clutched the phone as if it was her last weapon in a war she didn't ask to fight. Melissa gave them both a look that said we're not backing down. She had come home expecting to bring cake and hugs. Instead, she had walked into a masquerade of betrayal. But the masks were cracking. And beneath them, she saw fear beginning to sweat. It wasn't long before Geraldine offered herself to the fire without realizing it. That afternoon, While Melissa made stew in the kitchen with one ear cocked like a wolf in the woods, she heard Ava's soft voice through the thin corridor walls. It was the usual routine, Geraldine complaining about the bed sheets not being aired properly, accusing Ava of laziness, asking her why her mother suddenly had time to come sniffing around. But then came the golden arrow. Geraldine's voice dropped, her tone venomous. "You think she came back for you? Please. She probably just lost her job and came crawling back. And when she goes again, you'll still be here, under my roof, cleaning my toilet." Melissa froze, her hand hovering over the pot. Ava said nothing, but the silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Later that evening, Ava handed Melissa the recording, her fingers trembling like a leaf in harmattan. Melissa listened to it 3 times. Each time, her stomach twisted tighter. It wasn't just the cruelty, it was the confidence. Geraldine had said those words with the assurance of a woman who believed she was untouchable. Melissa's rage sat in her chest like hot coal under a silk blouse, hidden but burning. The next day, she visited the local printing shop, made 3 copies of her bank statements, printed screenshots of every transfer labeled for Ava, and placed them in a brown envelope. Then she wrote a letter addressed to the church board where Geraldine served as treasurer. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Quiet thunder. She didn't send it yet. But she held it like a sword tucked into her waist wrapper, waiting for the right time to strike. Over the next 2 days, the air in the house turned thick, as if every breath carried secrets too heavy to exhale. Geraldine seemed to sense the shift. She stopped making jokes. Her laughter dried up like a well with no spring. She watched Melissa out of the corner of her eye, suspicious but still clinging to her self-importance. Liam began spending more time at the church library after school, quietly digging up details about how funds were managed, subtly noting inconsistencies he remembered hearing Geraldine brag about over the phone, things she never expected a boy to understand. Melissa, in turn, began planting whispers, small comments at the tailor's shop, at the market, at the community borehole. Things are not always what they seem. Sometimes the people with the loudest halos have the darkest corners. She never mentioned names. She didn't have to. Brinley was a town that knew how to connect dots. Geraldine, unaware that her kingdom had begun to crumble, made one final error. She slapped Ava. It wasn't new. It had happened before, but this time it left a mark. A red, blooming handprint across her cheek. Melissa didn't scream. She didn't weep. She took a picture. Then she sat Ava down, kissed her forehead, and said calmly, "You've suffered enough. It ends now." That evening, with Ava sitting beside her like a phoenix reborn from soot, Melissa pressed send on the email to the church board. Attached were the recordings, the statements, the photo, and a letter signed not just with her name, but with her truth. News in Brinley traveled faster than fire on dry grass. By morning, Geraldine's name had spilled from mouths like it had been sitting on their tongues all along, waiting for permission to fly. Whispers turned to gasps, and gasps turned to questions. By noon, the church elders called an emergency meeting. Melissa received a call she had expected, but still didn't relish. "We need you and Ava to come to the church office." Geraldine was already there, pacing like a caged animal, her smile now a shaky thread holding her dignity together. Melissa entered with Ava and sat quietly, allowing Geraldine to rant, to weep, to deny, to twist the narrative like a wet cloth. But when the recording was played aloud, the part where she spoke of Ava scrubbing toilets and being abandoned, the silence in the room turned icy. Even Geraldine's tears seemed to dry mid-cheek. One elder cleared his throat and said simply, "Madam, this is not the woman we thought we knew." Geraldine tried to defend herself, but the evidence was stacked like bricks. Melissa didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She stood up, gently helped Ava to her feet, and said with a voice that cracked but never broke, "We trusted her, and she broke it like glass under a jealous heel." They walked out together, mother and daughter, sunlight hitting their faces as if the sky itself had been waiting to bless their return. Behind them, Geraldine sat alone, surrounded by everything she once used to build her pride, now turning to dust right before her eyes. The walk back from the church office felt like crossing a bridge that had been burning quietly for years, now reduced to glowing ash under their feet. Ava clutched Melissa's hand tightly, as though afraid that freedom was too fragile to last. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one a whisper of relief wrapped in uncertainty. Melissa said little. She had learned that some victories made more noise in silence than in speech. The villagers didn't approach them directly, but the glances were louder than drums. Some looked at Melissa with awe, others with embarrassment, and a few with grudging admiration, like they had seen a woman walk into fire and come out with her name unscorched. Ava, sensing the shift, tilted her chin slightly higher. It wasn't pride yet, but the soft awakening of dignity that had been sleeping too long. Back at the house, they found Geraldine's car gone. Her son, Liam, stood by the gate, holding a small bag, his eyes flickering between guilt and freedom. "She's gone to stay with Auntie Lola for now," he mumbled. "Said she needed space." Melissa nodded once, gestured for him to come inside. That night, the three of them sat in the small parlor. No television, no fan, just the sound of rain tap dancing on the roof like an orchestra of second chances. Melissa made okra soup, and Ava insisted on helping, her hands moving slower than memory but steadier than fear. Over dinner, Liam asked, "Are we going to leave this house?" Melissa looked at him, then at Ava, and answered with a calm that settled into the walls, "We'll decide together." The following day carried a different flavor, like the air itself had been sweetened by truth. Melissa took Ava to the tailor's shop to pick new fabric. It wasn't about clothes. It was about the ceremony of reclaiming self-worth, stitch by stitch. The tailor, a plump woman named Sissy Binta, gave Ava a long look before measuring her shoulders and waist. "You've grown taller," she said gently. "You must eat well now." Ava smiled, a real one this time, like the sun peeking from behind the ruins of a storm. Afterward, they stopped by the community library, where Melissa helped Ava get a membership card and borrowed a novel by Chimamanda. The librarian, an elderly man with spectacles always sliding down his nose, whispered, "Your daughter has your eyes and your strength." Melissa chuckled softly. "She has more." In the market later that afternoon, people approached her, not to pry, but to express quiet solidarity. "I didn't know what she was doing to that girl," one woman murmured. "If I had known, I swear." Melissa raised a hand. "No shame," she said. "The curtain's down now. What matters is the healing." And healing, she knew, wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a slow fire that warmed, not burns. That evening, they returned home to find Geraldine's brother waiting outside, arms folded. He was older, salt-haired, and spoke with the weight of family pride bruised by embarrassment. "My sister isn't perfect," he began. "But if there's any way to make amends," Melissa cut him off kindly but firmly. "She made choices, not mistakes. What she owes us isn't apology, it's acknowledgement." He looked at Ava, then back at Melissa, then walked away, his silence saying everything words could not. Night came like a soft curtain, and for the first time in weeks, Melissa didn't bolt the door out of habit. There was peace in the walls now, not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of calm, earned, not inherited. Ava sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling in a notebook. When Melissa asked what she was writing, Ava smiled faintly. "Just thoughts. I want to remember this." Not the pain. The turning point. Melissa nodded, her throat tightening. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled out an old family photo, Ava as a toddler, Melissa in her nurse's uniform, both laughing mid-swing at a park. She handed it to Ava, who studied it for a long moment. "I want to become her again," Ava whispered. "The girl in this picture." Melissa replied gently, "She never left. She just went quiet. Outside, the crickets chirped like witnesses signing a testimony. Liam returned from his friend's house with 2 loaves of bread and a pack of Milo. "We're out of milk," he said, tossing the groceries on the table. Melissa ruffled his hair. "We'll get some tomorrow." No one mentioned Geraldine's name. It was like a ghost that had finally stopped knocking. That night, Melissa opened her journal, the one she had carried across oceans but hadn't touched in months. She began a new entry. Today, Ava chose fabric. Tomorrow, we might choose to leave. But tonight, we are whole. And sometimes, wholeness is louder than justice. She closed the book, leaned back, and let sleep take her gently. 2 days later, the doorbell rang, and standing at the gate was a woman Melissa didn't recognize at first. Her face was puffy, her shoulders slumped, and the usual fire in her posture had been replaced with wet smoke. Geraldine. She didn't step in. She just stood there, barefoot in cheap slippers, holding a yellow envelope. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "Just came to give you this." Melissa didn't reach for it. "What is it?" Geraldine's voice cracked. "Money. I used some of what you sent. Bought things." "Leet." "I don't know how much, but I calculated what I could. It's not full, but it's what I have." Melissa stared at her. "And why are you giving it back?" Geraldine swallowed hard. "Because the shame won't let me sleep. And because you trusted me. I broke something I can't fix. But maybe I can pay for the crack." Melissa looked down at the envelope, then back up. "This won't change anything." Geraldine nodded. "I know, but maybe it'll let me change." Then she turned and walked away, the envelope still trembling in her hand. Melissa didn't follow. She walked back inside, found Ava reading by the window, and said nothing. But Ava looked up and asked, "Was that her?" Melissa nodded. Ava didn't ask what she wanted. She didn't need to. Some ghosts don't need confrontation. They need forgetting. And that was a gift Ava had finally learned to give herself. Later, as dusk painted the house gold, the air hummed not with triumph, but with something better, peace dressed in quiet. The final days in Brinley passed like pages of a weathered book, soft, turning slowly, yet weighted with meaning. Melissa sat on the veranda each morning with her cup of tea, not because the tea was sweet, but because the silence around her had finally learned to sit still. The neighbors, once curious bystanders, had grown respectfully quiet. Some nodded when she walked past. Others murmured small words of admiration under their breath, but no one asked intrusive questions anymore. Ava began venturing into town on her own, her shoulders no longer curled inward like a question mark. She held her back straighter, not out of defiance, but because dignity had returned to her bones. One afternoon, she came home carrying a folder. Inside were application forms for a youth photography workshop. Melissa didn't ask why. She simply hugged her. Ava's healing was taking its own shape, and Melissa knew better than to sculpt it for her. She had learned that recovery was not a performance, and survival wasn't something you clapped for. It was something you respected. One evening, while cleaning out the small storeroom where Ava once slept, Melissa found the broken handle of an old broom hidden behind a pile of boxes. She picked it up, stared at it for a long time, then quietly stepped outside and tossed it into the refuse bin. Some things didn't deserve to be recycled. Some memories weren't meant to return. With the house finally quiet, Melissa began packing slowly. She hadn't yet decided where they would go, but she knew they wouldn't stay in Brinley. The house, though stripped of Geraldine's presence, still whispered her name through the walls. Ava needed a new rhythm, one that didn't echo the steps of a woman who'd once held her future hostage. One night they stayed up late, laughing over Puff Puff and roasted corn as Liam taught them how to play a board game he'd built from cardboard and bottle caps. It was the kind of moment that slipped gently into the soul and stitched peace into old wounds. Melissa watched them from across the table, her daughter, once cracked open by betrayal, now blooming quietly beside a boy who had turned against his own blood to stand for truth. And it struck her then, even in the garden of loss, loyalty could grow. The next morning, Ava knocked on her mother's door, holding a brown envelope, the same one Geraldine had tried to return money in. But it was no longer filled with shame. Inside was a note Ava had written, for our next home. Not to start over, but to begin again, without pretending. Melissa read the note 3 times, then folded it gently and slipped it into her purse. No need to respond. Some words weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to be kept. The week they left Brinley, the sky looked as if it, too, was ready for change. A soft drizzle fell again, gentle like memory, cleansing but not flooding. Melissa hired a small van to help with the bags. Most of their belongings were modest, clothes, books, a few kitchen pots, but what they carried in spirit weighed more than any suitcase. Liam stood by the gate as they loaded the final bag. "You'll be okay?" he asked, looking at Ava. She nodded, then surprised him with a hug. "You saved me," she said simply. He looked startled, then embarrassed, then proud, all in one breath. Melissa gave him a small wrapped parcel. "There's a notebook in there," she said, "for your stories. I think you've got plenty to tell." He smiled wide, the kind of smile only boys who had wrestled with guilt and one knew how to wear. As they drove out of Brinley, Ava kept her window down, the wind brushing her face like a blessing. She watched the houses blur past, each one holding 100 untold stories. Some painful, some warm, all true. Melissa didn't say a word. She simply held the steering wheel, her grip firm, her eyes ahead. The road was long, the journey uncertain, but their silence was no longer heavy. It was full of promise, full of breath, full of a life waiting to be lived, unmasked, unchained. Weeks later, they settled in a small town called Rose Bay, far from Brinley's curious eyes and closer to their own rhythm. The house they rented had pale blue shutters and a courtyard filled with bougainvillea that bloomed like it had something to prove. Ava decorated her room with hand-drawn sketches and pinned her workshop registration to the wall. Melissa returned to nursing part-time and spent her free hours journaling, sometimes about Lisbon, sometimes about Brinley, but mostly about Ava. On one quiet evening, as the golden hour stretched across the garden like honey poured from heaven, Ava sat beside her mother, legs curled under her, journal in lap. "Do you regret anything?" she asked. Melissa looked at the sky, then at her daughter. "Not everything," she said slowly. "Some things, yes. But you, never." Ava nodded and leaned into her shoulder, and together they watched the light soften into dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang a tune that sounded like forgiveness. And in that moment, Melissa understood, some endings aren't loud. Some victories don't shout. They arrive quietly, like a whisper in your own voice, telling you, you made it. And just like that, the story that began with betrayal folded gently into peace, not with fireworks, but with the silent bloom of a heart that had learned to beat without chains. Not everyone who laughs with you is rooting for you. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from hands you once trusted to catch you. If this story teaches anything, it's that silence isn't loyalty, and enduring pain in secret doesn't make you strong. It just makes you invisible. Speak up, protect your peace. And remember, the people who truly love you won't make you shrink to fit their comfort. May your heart never be a resting place for betrayal. May every false friend be unmasked before they harm what you hold dear. May God surround you with those who celebrate you, not those who secretly compete with you. May your healing be loud, your peace be permanent, and your joy be untouchable. In seasons when people try to dim your light, may your spirit burn even brighter. May your name never be used in rooms to dishonor you. May God bless you with wisdom to discern, strength to walk away, and grace to rebuild. If you believe that, shout a thunderous amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.